Photo skills, the fastest way to learn.
The exposure triangle. Understanding how shutter speed, aperture and ISO will all affect your images. Let's compare the settings. Now, we've all seen images that are under and overexposed, but let's have a look at them. So overexposed, you have blown highlights, lots of details in all the light areas, and generally not a good photo. Correctly exposed, you have the full dynamic range, so everything that you need to see in the dark areas, everything you need to see in the light areas, it's all there. The underexposed, you lose all of the details in the shadow, and it's just not a great photo. So there's three settings that matter. Shutter speed. This is obviously how fast the shutter opens and closes. Slower speeds will let more light in. Slower speeds will also show motion blur. Slower speeds are also less forgiving of camera shake, so try and stay above 1/80th of a second minimum if you're shooting handheld, or at least the focal length. So if you're shooting on a 300mm zoom lens zoomed right in, you want to be at 320th of a second shutter speed. This will decrease the amount of blur you get. Aperture. Now, this is the size of the hole through the lens. The wider the aperture, the more light it lets in. Wider apertures will give a much shallower depth of field, the bit of the photo that's in focus. It's measured in stops, and they're normally referred to as f-stops, and the higher the number, the smaller the aperture. I know. ISO. Now the ISO just alters the sensitivity of the camera sensor to light. The lower the ISO, the better the image quality. High ISOs will introduce grain and noise to your images. Now, in photography we talk about stops and f-stops a lot, but in essence a stop of adjustment will change the light available to the camera. Weirdly, if you increase the settings by going up a stop, you halve the light. Decrease the settings by going down a stop, you double the light. But to make matters worse, the settings make no logical sense. Shutter speed goes down to increase the light, aperture goes down to increase the light, but the hole in the lens gets bigger, and ISO goes up to increase the light. But don't worry, you'll soon get the hang of it. So shutter speeds, f-stops. Let's have a look at this. We're going to take an imaginary reading of where the correct exposure should be. And shutter speed, now obviously it's just the amount of time that the shutter stays open. Yeah, all it does is it lifts it up out of the way of the sensor so that the sensor can see what's going on through the lens. It's your shutter speed that controls how movement appears in your images. So a very fast shutter speed will freeze motion of a moving subject, and a slow shutter speed will blur motion. So if we assume that your camera's light meter shows a correct exposure of 1/60th of a second, halving the shutter speed will double the amount of light hitting the sensor by a whole stop. So you're now down to 1/30th of a second, you're overexposed by one stop. Doubling the shutter speed halves the amount of light hitting the sensor, and it will decrease your exposure by a whole stop. In reality, the longer the shutter is open, the more time the sensor has to collect the available light. That's the crux of it. That's the be-all and end-all. Aperture. All your aperture does when you alter it in the camera is open or closes the blades in the lens. This increases or decreases the size of the hole, letting more or less light onto the sensor. Exactly the same principle as open or closing the curtains of your windows. The wider the opening that the curtains are, the brighter the room becomes. And the same principle as shutter speed. Increase by a stop and the light goes down, reduce by a stop and the light goes up. Your aperture controls how much of the photo is also in focus. So here we have f8. That's your correct exposure in this example. Obviously every picture will be different. So you halve it, your aperture is twice as wide, it lets in twice as much light, so you're now overexposed by a whole stop. Halve the aperture size, so increase the aperture to f11, you halve the amount of light hitting, and you underexpose by a whole stop. Sorry, I'm getting myself confused here. Okay, so a one stop reduction will open the blades further and let in twice as much light. A one stop increase will close the blades and let in half as much light. As I said before, it also controls the depth of field, as it's usually referred to, DOF. This is how much of your image is in focus. How far you are from your subject will also have a major effect on your depth of field. So if you're standing 5 feet away from someone and you take a photo of f8, they're pretty much all going to be, the whole of that person will be in focus. You do it again, but taking a photo of an insect on a flower, you're probably only going to get the head of the insect in focus. Everything else will start to drop off. You need to experiment with this. ISO. ISO is noise. ISO is how you introduce noise to your photos. Yeah? It controls the camera's sensor sensitivity to light. Now, back in the days before digital cameras, the only way to control the ISO was to change the film in the camera. If you wanted to shoot in the sun, you needed to change the film if you'd been shooting in low light the previous day. These days, though, you just alter the ISO on the camera and it does it for you. You should always try and shoot with the ISO set as low as possible for the lighting. As you increase the ISO and the sensitivity, you lose image quality and start to introduce noise and grain to your images, and you'll begin to lose detail. Now, each camera model has a completely different capability when handling ISO noise, so you have to experiment with yours. Some cameras are superb and can take images with usable amounts of noise and grain right up to ISO 40,000, whilst others will produce usable images only up to ISO 3200. Full frame cameras seem to have the edge here, but you will need to experiment again. So on this one, let's have a look. Your exposure. So the correct exposure for this particular image would have been ISO 200. Double it to ISO 400, you let in twice as much light, your exposure goes up by a stop, you're now a whole stop overexposed. ISO 100, you've halved the ISO, you've decreased the sensitivity to light by half, so you're now a whole stop underexposed. Whole stops, they're always achieved by either doubling or halving whichever setting you're adjusting. So shutter speeds is worked out in fractions of a second, f-stops is worked out, aperture is worked out in quite a complex actually calculation to do with the diameter of the hole through the center in relation to the size of the entire lens aperture. And ISO is worked out by Blackmagic or something similar. I really don't know what that one is, but just know that if you halve it, you lose light, you double it, you gain light. At the end of the day, all you need to do is just try and remember to keep your exposure meter in the middle in the camera. When you look through the viewfinder, you see that little meter that with the needle that moves up and down when you're out with the settings. Keep that in the middle, you won't go far wrong. So, what does this mean for your photos? If you set your camera on auto, it will sort out what it considers to be the best combination of settings to give you the best possible exposure. However, this is probably not the look you're after. This is where you employ what you know about the exposure triangle to create the look you really want. So you gain control, style, your personal look and the feel for your image. Alter the aperture to change which bits of the image in focus. Change the shutter speed to capture motion or blur, and change the ISO to brighten or darken the image, in essence. However, if you imagine a balloon, so you got a long balloon, 3 settings printed on it. If you use to squeeze one of those settings, the other 2 will change in size. Yeah, this is not a great example because aperture might go down, shutter speed might go up, but you can't do this with a balloon. But if you squeeze or let go, you're going to alter the other 2. So you can see that there is a relationship between each of the 3 elements, the ISO, the shutter and the aperture. You change one, the other 2 will change automatically if you want to achieve the same exposure value. Let's have a look at some examples. All right, so let's say you want to capture a car moving past you at speed. Now you know to do this, to capture anything moving fast, to freeze motion, you need a fast shutter speed. So let's say we need 1/1000th of a second. Now this will reduce the amount of time that the sensor is exposed to light. We only want the car to be in focus, so we need to keep the aperture relatively wide to decrease the depth of field so that everything behind the car is blurred. Now that may well be enough to compensate for having the increased shutter speed, because you've halved the amount of time, or you've reduced the amount of time that the sensor is exposed to light, but you've also opened your lens a lot wider to allow more light in. So it's just a case of balancing the two until you get the exposure you want. If it's a dull day, you might have to increase the ISO as well, just to bring the sensitivity back up. Let's think of another one. Okay, so you want a really close up. Another example, you want a close up or a macro shot of an insect on a flower. Now when you move the lens very close to an object, you automatically reduce the depth of field. So you need to close the aperture down as much as possible to give you the maximum depth of field. So you dial in f22, which is really reduces the hole through the lens. It becomes almost like a pinhole camera. Doesn't let a lot of light in. Now you know when shooting handheld that 1/80th of a second is going to be the slowest that you really want your shutter speed to be, to reduce the risk of camera shake and blurred images. So that just leaves the ISO to bring the exposure up. Now, macro shooting always requires a lot of light because of the tiny apertures involved. It's often worth using a torch or a flash so that you don't have to increase the ISO way up and introduce grain and lose all the detail in your images. Let's have a look at some of the modes that are available to you. M or manual. You have full control of the shutter, the aperture and the ISO. This is where you should be aiming to shoot from. You have full control and you can alter the way that everything looks in your image. This is where your full creative control happens. Okay. TV or S. As shutter speed. Now in this mode the camera will keep the shutter where you've set it and adjust the aperture and the ISO to keep the exposure correct. This is a good way to learn about how to use your shutter speed and what the other two settings are doing to your image. It's very handy for sports or wildlife photography where you want to capture action, or you might want to go the other way and have the shutter stay open for longer because you want to blur water coming out of a tap, for example. Now the AV mode or aperture mode, here you decide how wide the lens is, and that will dictate how great your depth of field is. It's great for portraits, when you want to blur the background and make your subject really stand out. Bulb mode is another one you'll often find on your dial. Now this is used for long exposure photos. This is where you press the shutter button and the shutter will stay open for as long as you hold the button down. Long exposures are a subject all on their own. We'll cover this later in more advanced sections of the course, but for the moment you just need to know what it is. Most of the other modes are just for telling the camera what type of colour profile you'd like to use, or variations on the auto mode. You lose almost all of the control that you gain from using the full modes listed above. You do need to be careful, however, when you're using modes. AV mode in particular should be avoided in low light, or for night photography or anything similar, unless you're set up on a tripod and you're prepared for it. If the camera thinks that it needs a 5-second exposure to collect enough light, that's exactly what it will do. There is no way you are holding a camera still for 5 seconds. Just isn't happening. TV mode should only be used when you don't care about the depth of field. For example, if you're shooting a moving horse at a horse race or something like that, it doesn't matter if you catch the rest of the track in focus, because that'll set it. If you use TV mode when you're shooting a group of people, for example, in low light, the camera may decide that it wants the aperture as wide as possible, which won't give you enough depth of field to get the whole group of people in focus. You'll find that the people in the front row are perfectly in focus, but anybody stood behind them have started to blur. So, play, practice, learn. Shoot as often as possible. Can't stress that one enough. Shoot as often as possible. When you're learning, nothing beats practice and experimentation. Just play. So, let's give you some go-to settings. take your camera into manual mode. Okay, there, wasn't that scary, was it? Now set it up like this. Set your ISO on auto, put your aperture to f8, and set your shutter speed to at least 1/80th of a second, or if you're going to be shooting on a zoomed in lens, at least the length of that lens. So if you're shooting at 70, 200, 300, you want to be at 80, 200, 320, somewhere around there, but that will reduce your blur. You'll soon get the hang of it, but yeah, have a play with that. You'll find that you are now in manual mode with a set of settings where you stand a reasonable chance of getting images that are just that bit different from what you would get out of auto. They may not be the look you're after, but now you know and understand what each of the settings will do, you can have a play. When you get back home, put your card in your computer, zoom right in, have a look at what it's doing. Look at the images on the computer. Are you getting too much grain? In which case the ISO is too high. Is the depth of field too narrow? Then your aperture is too wide. Is the image blurred? Then your shutter speed was too low. You can use these anytime you like. They are a great set of go-to settings. So it's ISO on auto, aperture f8, shutter speed at least as high as your focal length, or at least above 80 if you're only on a 50mm lens. The only time you might want to change this is if it's a very sunny day, in which case you can use an aperture of f16, which is also known in photography circles as sunny 16. There, you now begin shooting in manual. It really is as simple as that, and it's just a case of play, practice, learn, and keep doing it. Now in the next few videos we're going to explore each of the three settings. We're going to have a look at motion capture and freezing using the shutter speed, depth of field using the aperture, and how high is too high for ISO, and when adding grain can actually improve your photo.